Greetings from the state of Maine. By way of Montana. Just to show you where we are, this is the state of Maine. We're in the far corner on the East Coast. We border one state, New Hampshire, and mostly Canada. And we're known for our lobsters and blueberries and trees. And I have to tell you that where we primarily operate, I'm going to try and use this little thing, which is not going to show up. But the stem of the blueberry is about where KFI's main office is located. So we're far away from lobsters and blueberry barrens, but we're thick with trees. And we also have this beautiful mountain in our backyard. Now, who am I to talk about mountains in Wyoming, right? This impresses the hell out of folks in Rhode Island. But anyway, why I show you that mountain is because the name of that mountain is Mount Katahdin. And Katahdin is the K in KFI. It doesn't matter where I go, what profound things I tell people. At the end, somebody always raises their hand and says, but what does KFI stand for? So it stands for Katahdin Friends Incorporated. We're known by our initials because we're long past the days when we think we can be people's friends. Our job is to connect them to others and hope that friendship occurs. So let's get to it. Who the heck are we? Well, we provide customized supports for people to live in their own homes, work in regular community businesses, and be members and contributors to their communities. But it wasn't always this way. So we are a 52-year-old community service agency, and for about 20 years or so, we built a building, we bought a building, we rented a building, we rented a home. We spent all of our energy creating places and programs that segregated people from society. So this is what we looked like 30 years ago. So we had a segregated special purpose school, so that was for kids from 5 to age 20. We also had a segregated preschool program. We had a sheltered workshop, a segregated day program. We had a thrift store. Think about all the things that, our industry has built to keep folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities busy and captive, and we did that. People lived in foster homes or they lived with family members. We did have a 4-bed group home that was a real utter failure and easy to close down. Everyone was transported to one location. We had agency-owned and operated vans. Services were only provided in KFI-owned buildings, and we served people in groups. Groups. So this is a picture of Leo. And Leo was working in KFI's Work Activity Center, which was the name of our day program, in about 1980. And he attended that day program 5 days a week. He was a very slow worker, but he had great social skills. And we had been, he lived with his father in a neighboring town, in my hometown, his hometown of Millinocket, a little community of about 5,000 people. Leo's mom had died fairly early on. And we had been helping folks in our sheltered workshop get jobs in the community. And lo and behold, there was this opportunity for a job in Millinocket, and we looked around our shelter workshop and we said, gosh, there's nobody from Millinocket, and transportation is just going to be such an issue. We've really got to find somebody from Millinocket to fill that job. That's not how we go about job development these days, but that's how we did it back then. And so we looked around this day program where work was inconsequential, people earned sub-minimum wage. And we looked at Leo. He's so slow. But he has great social skills, and the job was in a little restaurant. He could walk to work. Okay. Let's see if Leo wants that job. You know the rest of the story, don't you? He was a great success. Leo was a great success. And Leo continued to teach us the lesson that we were learning from others, that sheltered work is a poor predictor of success in the community. I feel like I need some audience participation. Everybody, sheltered work is a poor predictor of success in the community. Please believe that. Supported employment's failure to solve all problems and why we did not have to launch a second career. See, we thought we're going to work ourselves out of business. This is going to be pretty awesome, actually. Well, that's not the end of the story of Leo. Leo's father died, tragically, in a snowmobiling accident on one of Maine's many not quite so frozen lakes. Leo was sent to live with various siblings. One of those siblings lived in Connecticut, one lived in Florida. He lost his home, he lost his job. So we were beginning to learn the lesson that where people live define what they do during the day. Leo was homeless, essentially. And we said to Leo's sisters, you know, if Leo moved back to Millinocket, we think that we know what it takes to support Leo to live in a home of his own. And that's what happened. Leo is a homeowner. He works at a credit union 20 hours a week. Actually, he's down to 10 hours a week due to some health issues. He's worked with only natural supports at that credit union for over 20 years. He's a member of the Knights of Columbus. He volunteers at his church's thrift store every week. And Leo receives 7 hours a week of paid supports. That's it. There are many Leos living in group homes. Let me assure you. So, how did we arrive with these customized supports for people? Well, in the early 80s, we asked two fundamental questions. The first one, is anyone anywhere doing anything better? Now, this is going to shock some of you in the audience. This was before the internet. You couldn't just Google who's doing something better. We had to join national organizations. We had to go to their conferences. We had to read the journal articles. We had to reach out to people. Because we didn't want to know, are they doing something better in Bangor or Boston? We said anyone, anywhere. And we started hearing about people with intellectual disabilities going to work in regular community businesses for a minimum wage or higher in Madison, Wisconsin. And Lou Brown, kind of the grandfather of supported employment, came to Maine. He told stories, he showed slides, much like I'm going to do with you today. And Paul Wayman in Virginia Commonwealth University. And we were intrigued by that, because what that meant to us was if, for example, Gary, who was in the day program, if Gary lived in Madison, Wisconsin, what Lou Brown was saying is he could go to work for a community employer for a minimum wage or better. We didn't have to be Gary's employer. So, Gary would be the same guy, same disabilities, same challenges with the world. So that meant that Gary was just fine the way he was. Who had to change? We did. We did. And so the second question was, well, why can't we do that? Well, we could have said, we don't live close to a college campus. We're 60 miles away from a college campus. We don't have graduate students to serve as job coaches. We don't have a community filled with businesses. We are in a little rural area. We could have said that, but instead we said the essence of what Lou Brown and Paul Wayman were saying was people with disabilities are just as ready as they need to be today. It's up to us to change. So we had to figure out how we were going to do it, not how Paul Wayman and Lou Brown did it, but the essence of it. The essence of it was people with disabilities could go to work. We had to figure it out. Peter Drucker was a management writer. He's passed. And he said, just as important as the decision on what new and different things to do is the planned systematic abandonment of the old that no longer fits the purpose and mission of the business, no longer conveys satisfaction to the customer, no longer makes a superior contribution. What set KFI apart, we discovered, is we didn't just add supported employment to our continuum of services. We really felt like we had built a better mousetrap. And we abandoned sheltered work, subcontract work, sub-minimum wage. We abandoned it. We stopped doing it. It would be if you went to a doctor with an infection and the doctor said, well, I could give you this antibiotic or I could bleed you. No, the medical community has abandoned bleeding. So here are our conversion milestones really quickly. In 1985, we closed down the school. In 1987, we shut down our sheltered workshop. In 1989, we abolished all sheltered work in that day program. And in 1996, we ended all center-based services. So we've been doing this. We've been out on a limb, kind of dancing for a lot of years. We've sustained this. I want to talk about Dan. We call him Dan the Pioneer. A little bit about Dan. He has behavioral challenges. Many years ago, in 1989, he was about to be kicked out of his 7th foster home in 11 years. He was 27 years old. He had never spent any time without family and paid supports. And someone who worked for KFI said, you know, what if Dan just lived in his own place? And when he got mad and broke a stereo, he wouldn't have music to listen to now, would he? We call that natural consequences. But we said, but Dan's never spent a moment alone. He's always had a family around him, even if it hasn't been his own. What if he goes for a walk in the middle of the night? And so somebody who worked for KFI knew of a guy who rented rooms. He owned a large home. He rented rooms, And we thought, well, that would be kind of cool. Dan could rent a room with kitchen privileges, but the really cool thing about this guy was he owned the taxi service in this little community. Has one taxi. I don't know, does it still have a taxi, Barb? Lincoln? I don't think so. But anyway, in 1989, they had a taxi. It's our public transportation in Maine. And somebody was up all night dispatching. So there was kind of that safety net that people were worried about. And Dan moved into one of those rooms and lived there for about 3 months. Dan now owns his own home. He has about 39 hours of paid supports a week. He still has behavioral challenges. We didn't cure Dan with home ownership. But he has a hotline to a state crisis team. He has a warm line to KFI staff who work 24/7 awake in his community. And he goes across the street to the hospital, to the emergency room, way too frequently. But he has a laundry business, and Dan's life is really, really full in ways that we never could have predicted in 1989. So the lesson that Dan taught us long before the term self-determination became associated with people with disabilities, Dan taught us that what he needed was freedom to choose a meaningful life, and that was where he lived, who he lived with, what he did during the day, the authority to direct his life and receive customized supports, to take responsibility for his actions and their resulting consequences, and confirmation that he plays the most important role in his own life. And so the strategy was we helped Dan move into his own home, initially the rented room, and we changed the location of his supports from a day program to his own home and community. We celebrated when we couldn't keep track of where he was or who he knew. And there was a time I would have been able to draw Dan's circle of support. I knew it by heart, knew everybody in his life. Then he joined a men's bowling league, and he joined this club called the Lincoln Singles Club. And the only requirement to join the Lincoln Singles Club was you had to be excellent. I'm not throwing bubbles to y'all. And he met tons of people and had wonderful connections that supported him in ways that we as his paid supporters never, ever, ever could have accomplished. Story about Jackie. Who works for the state here? Raise your hand if you're, you'd never do this. I can tell. The state has the dollars, we've got the cents. Why apartments are better than galvanized wash tubs. Jackie was a woman who lived down a dirt road on the outskirts of a little community. She lived with her dad. Her mom had died. They lived in utter poverty. Jackie had a skin condition, a serious skin condition. She was actually hospitalized in a specialized hospital in New Hampshire for this skin condition. When she came out of the hospital, the doctor said, what Jackie really needs is she needs to be able to rinse her back every day. That's where it was the worst, was on her back. And Jackie didn't live in a home with the best of indoor facilities. Furthermore, Jackie and her dad had one of those old Wringer washing machines, and it just wouldn't wring that harsh soap out of her clothing and sheets and whatnot. And so the state said, why don't we buy a galvanized wash tub, and you can put it in your day program and draw a curtain around it, and someone can help Jackie rinse her back every day. And that's what we did. We did that. And then some bright bulb said, you know how Dan rents a room up the road? What if Jackie moved into her own apartment, had indoor plumbing? Wouldn't that just be a whole lot more respectful? But you know how it goes. when you're talking to families who live in poverty and they need that check, they need that income. And so I was actually the person who got to chat with Jackie's dad, and he thought it was a brilliant idea. And Jackie moved into her own apartment, acquired a pet bird, and lots of great Jackie stories. So we asked ourselves these two questions. If a person had the right kind and amount of supports, that's where the devil in the details are, right? Would he or she need to go to a day program, work in a shelter workshop, or live in a group home? The answer is no. And the question becomes, then how do we build those supports? It's a question that challenges us every day to this day. Here's Marie's challenge to KFI in 1991. She was institutionalized at the age of 11. When we met her, she had lived in a intermediate care facility nursing home for people with intellectual disabilities for about 10 years. She was kicked out of her day program for people with challenging behaviors because of challenging behaviors. She had one-on-one aides who worked in 4-hour shifts because people couldn't be with her for longer than that. She was considered extremely self-abusive, failure to thrive, profoundly cognitively disabled, and she was given a 30-day notice to leave that nursing home, and she was being sent to the state's institution in the closing days of that institution. No one had any answers for Marie. So in the words of that great poet, Jerry Garcia, somebody has got to do something, and it's incredibly pathetic that it's got to be us. The state came to us and said, okay, KFI, you've been running around the state saying that everybody, regardless of the severity and complexity of their disability, has the right to live in a home in their own with the right type and amount of supports. What do you think? Put your mouth where your money is, right? Which they didn't pay us for about 9 months. That's an interesting, you should say that. So we said, well, you know, we're going to meet Marie, and we're going to say that everybody, including Marie, has the right to live at home with the right type and amount of supports. And so it took about 9 months to do development for Marie. Marie was going to be moving back to her home community of Lincoln, where her mom and dad lived, and one of her sisters and her brother. And she was going to move into her own home that her parents rented from a typical landlord. And we hired staff, brought Marie out of the institution so that she can meet the staff, and we could kind of figure out how everything jived and who had a good relationship with her, who she took to. And long story short, this is Marie a few years ago, boating on one of Maine's many lakes. This is at Marie's last person-centered plan meeting, and her mom is sitting at the table and one paid staff. All the rest of those people in that picture are not paid to be with Marie. They're her friends and neighbors who adore her. Marie hosts neighborhood parties, and she's a member of the Golden Key Club in the community of Lincoln, where she meets and interacts. Even though Marie doesn't use words to communicate anything, she certainly loves to sit, and people love to sit and chat with her and drink coffee. So here's the lesson: that supporting people, no matter the complexities of their disabilities, to live in their own home and giving them control. That was the key. We gave Marie control, real choices, can produce miracles. Treatment, if you could have seen her treatment team, you know, it would almost fill this room. And treatment took the form of a real home, family connections, paying attention to what she showed us she wanted and needed, and less about her behavior and deficits. Those took care of themselves. Quick story about Brent. Brent had spent many years in KFI's day program. He left that program. I absolutely cannot remember why. I'm sure we weren't serving his needs very well at the time. And his dad died, and he had a horrible breakdown over that, and he actually was sent to live in the States Institution for a time. He came out of the institution, and he was placed in a series of group homes, and continually ran away. Brent continually ran away from those group homes, and he just kept saying he wanted to go home. Well, home for Brent was this place, his boyhood home in a little community called Howland. And his mother came to see me one day and said, "What do you think if Brent moves back to," his mom was still living in that home, "what if I move out and Brent moves in to that home, and would you, KFI, take over his supports?" We said, "Sounds like a deal to me." Brent ended up purchasing that home. He also ended up regaining his guardianship with his mother's blessing. He pursued his interest in camping. That's Brent's camper being hauled by one of his staff's vehicles. He interviews, and although we're the employer of record because we have to be in the state of Maine, Brent hires all of his own staff. And at that time, I mean, if you weren't interested in camping, you were not going to be supporting Brent. And so tragedy struck. His childhood home was condemned because of black mold, and Brent moved out and moved into an apartment while we scrambled and helped him to figure out how to refinance a replacement. And so he had a USDA loan of $68,000 and $32,500 in grants from the Maine State Housing Authority and the Penguins Community Action Program. And so that funded the rebuilding of Brent's beautiful home. So the lesson Brent taught us was that home is where the heart is. It's not home-like, it's not a residential program, it's not group housing. Home is where Brent grew up, established roots, and where everyone knows his name. So our strategy was simply to listen and do a little more listening. And more than listening to what Brent's words were, we were listening to his actions. We were listening to what he was saying with his actions. And his family made his dream come true, and we supported him to continue that dream through adversity. So, I want to talk a little bit about whole life supports. You know, gosh, we are really good at putting people in silos. Do you know what I mean? So there's like the residential program, and there's all those staff. Then there's the day program, there's all those staff. Then there's like the vocational, it could be shelter work, it could be a community work program. And all those staff are people, and they don't talk to one another. And we don't do things like that at KFI. We have staff teams around people. But we also look at people as a whole person. So what's the most compelling need? Robert was referred to us because he needed a job. He had graduated or aged out of high school, and he needed a job. But the problem was Robert was living in a children's foster home at the time, and he was going to have to move. So we said to Robert, well, where are you going to live first? Then we'll set about trying to figure out where you're going to work. So this was the special education book on Robert. It's a horrible list of things. Really horrible list of things that the school had to say about him. When I met with Robert, And I asked him, what do you want from KFI? This was his list. He wanted his own home, not an apartment, a one-story home with at least 2 bedrooms near the woods. Well, near the woods was not going to be a problem. He wanted a job, something working around cars. He wanted a red truck, and he wanted a woman. And when asked why, which was a stupid question to ask a 21-year-old, he said he wanted someone to hang his curtains and clean his house. So Robert's somewhat of a chauvinist, So Robert decided, I could spend a day talking about Robert and things he's taught us, but Robert decided he wanted to live in the community of Millinocket, my community, and he decided that because Millinocket at the time had 911, and the other community under consideration did not. You had to dial 7 numbers to get help versus 3. And you know, sure enough, Robert's first night in his new apartment, he dialed 911. Wouldn't you? If you made a life decision based on, I'm going to test it out, see if this thing really works. Yep, it does. So anyway, Robert's in this brand new community, job developers going around the community looking for opportunities around cars. And so we said, Robert, other than there was, cooking and laundry and budgeting and grocery shopping and house cleaning and all that boring stuff. Now, by the way, we had about 34 hours a week of supports for Robert, down from his 168. 34. So all those other things I mentioned just really kind of help prepare you for life. Those aren't the things that make you excited. Those aren't the things that make you get out of bed, put on your pants. So we said, Robert, what do you want to do? I'm kind of the Microsoft of agencies. Where do you want to go today? And he said, I want to go hunting. You want me to show you that scary list again? And we said, well, Robert, in Maine, in order to get a hunting license, you have to take a hunter safety course. And sure enough, there was one offered through adult education at our local high school. And so if I was going to write a chapter 3 about how you support someone in faith supports, it would go something like this. The community advocate, which is what we call our drug support professionals, helped Robert sign up for the course, transported him to the course, walked in with him, introduced him to the teacher, looked around the room, do I know anybody here? Can I make a connection? Can I get him a ride? Can I get him a study buddy? Because I got 34 hours of paid supports and I'm not sitting in a hunter safety course. So it became imperative that we built community for Robert within that course. Staff person fades. Job developer. He comes to the very last tiny place. It's like a satellite car dealership. It's a one mechanic shop. And he goes in, and I don't know, what did job developers say anyway? Bunch of BS, I think, but probably he said something like, I've got this guy, yada, yada, yada. And the manager said, we have a need for a car detailer. Some guy is out, maybe indefinitely, I don't know. Go talk to the mechanic. If the mechanic says it's okay with me. So Bill goes back and he talks to the mechanic, and I've got this guy. And the mechanic said, who are you talking about? And Bill said, doesn't matter. He's new in town. Mechanic persists. No, who are you talking about? Bill says, okay, Robert Tyler. And the mechanic said, Robert? I'm his hunter safety instructor. And of course, he got the job. This is Robert today. Robert also is a homeowner. He works 14 hours a week in the meat department of our local grocery store. But he has this very robust volunteer schedule that he sets for himself, where he is absolutely needed and valued and wanted in a way that really enriches and satisfies him. He receives about 24 hours of paid supports a week. You know what, folks? There is just no doubt in my mind that if Robert lived anyplace else, he would definitely be in a group home. He would definitely be in a shelter workshop. No doubt in my mind. So he's a member of the Knights of Columbus. He's a member of a fitness club. He's done some advocacy and public speaking, and he's a good neighbor. His next-door neighbor is the local barber, and Robert owns a mobile home in a mobile home park, and there was a neighbor in between them, and he was selling his mobile home, and the barber bought that mobile home and had it hauled away to use for his own property because he said he was guaranteed a good next-door neighbor in Robert. So community is relationships. It's not places. When I think about how I've lived in the same zip code for 61 years, I live and work in my hometown. How unusual is that these days? But my community has changed very, very dramatically. My associations and relationships with people from when I was a little girl to a teenager to a young married woman to a young mother to an empty nester, an elected official. All of those things have occurred within one zip code, but far different communities. And so community is where no one goes unmissed. Quickly, Melinda, we were talking at lunch about people with physical and medical challenges. Melinda is a woman who has use of her eyelids and a leg, and so she presented great physical challenges around renting her own home. Melinda has a feeding tube, so she presented great medical challenges with staffing. And Melinda doesn't use words to communicate, and so she presented challenges with relationship building. But Melinda does rent her own home. She has a roommate who sings lots of old songs to her. And they really are just Felix and Oscar of roommates, I'll tell you. Her landlord agreed to the installation of a Hoyer lift system in the house, paid for by the Medicaid waiver. And our staff are trained to feed Melinda. Like, they're not CNAs, they're not nurses, you don't need to be. They know how to do it, they know what it takes, they know what to look for, they know when problems occur. And her communication challenges do not prevent her from being a valued member of her community. And this is Melinda with a church group of women. This is Pam. Pam also represents a woman with medical challenges and physical challenges. Pam experiences blindness. She has incredible issues around pain. She also lives in a low-income housing complex retrofitted with a Hoyer lift. Her family, Pam lived at home with her mother until her mother died. And that's just like a recipe for disaster, isn't it? God, we got to do something about that. And the story ended well for Pam because her brother was very involved in her life, and as a matter of fact, her brother and his family live in that same low-income housing complex, and they provide all of the overnight supports for her. Otherwise, Pam would probably have to have a roommate, and that just wouldn't be good for the roommate. So she can swear like a longshoreman, but she lives in this tiny community of Mattawamkeag, and Pam loves flowers, and so she helps planting all the flowers in the complex. And you know, when you're in little communities, you have to find who are the do-gooders, who are the people, what's the group that puts on the benefit supper when someone is in need? Who are those people? And then you make connection, and they've really embraced Pam. Pam also belongs to a church. And this is Fritz. Fritz was institutionalized in our state institution for the vast majority of his life. Fritz has PKU. It went untreated for years, resulting in brain damage and other behaviors that, because he was untreated for his PKU, when he lived in the institution, he had a lot of stripping his clothes off behaviors and things like that. When he came out of the institution, he lived in an 8-bed group home, and he required one-to-one staffing in the group home because he was the only person with PKU living there, and everybody else had really good food, and he didn't. And so he would get up in the middle of the night and, raid the refrigerator and the cupboards, and it was just horrible. He hated the day program. He hated the van ride to the day program. So we were asked if we could support Fritz. He was originally from the community of Lincoln. We brought him back to that community, actually found some family who he connects with every week, Aunt Vaina. And here's the thing. Here's the thing. Fritz has tickets to the symphony. He loves classical music. He insists the newspaper be read to him every day. He hardly ever misses a broadcast of the evening news. Do you know where he was last weekend? He was at a Jimmy Buffett tribute band concert with his Margaritaville t-shirt on. So he's a parrot head. Here's my question to you. Let's just say we could go back in time 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Go to the institution. Talk to those people, well-meaning folks who knew him. And if we said to them, 30 years from now, he'll live in his own home, he'll have a dog named Zoe, we'll discover his love of classical music, and he'll be a regular at the symphony. He'll be a parrot head. They'd probably whisk us away to the delusional wing, huh? But all that's true. And Fritz is the same guy. What's different? It's us. It's us. We need to be the difference. I'm going to end by reading a paragraph from a book, sadly out of print. It's called The Whole Community Catalog. And it's vignettes from some really remarkable people. And George Durner wrote a page on becoming a member of the community. And essentially what he was saying is that we, Human Services, represent a barrier to people developing relationships in the community. We take the place of that. We prevent that from happening. And this is what he said about home. We have placed people in homes that are not really homes, but rather training centers, schools, and miniature institutions. It is important that we become more sensitive to the basic human need that people have for a true home, a place where one can relax and have a sense of peace and security, a place where one is allowed to escape for a moment from the stresses and demands of the world outside, a place where one belongs simply because it is home. We should not find ourselves surrounded by our teachers, trainers, or people called staff in our home. Home is where people accept us and value us because of who we are, not because of how we perform. Perhaps we are trying to do too many things for people under the same roof. That is always the case in institutions. The result is we lose the space, that sacred space called home, where relationships are held more important than anything else. Thank you.